Okay, so one thing I'd like to do today is go over the different painting mediums. Maybe you haven't bought your supplies yet, which is fine because this first week is about getting set up, and maybe you're on the fence whether or not to use oils or acrylics. Um, to be honest, in an at-home situation, there's a little bit less complication with using acrylics. However, oil paint does afford you a lot of flexibility, and I think anybody that learns oil painting realizes it's not as complicated as it might seem at first. And like I said, gives you a lot of options. So it's kind of up to you what you want to decide to do. Anyways, here's the video. Let's take a look. Okay, so students, first thing is you're going to need something to paint on. And I grabbed just a bunch of canvas boards because they were inexpensive. For demos, that's what I like to use. And for a beginning painting class, that probably makes sense, at least for your first couple. They're less expensive. They're just made out of cardboard and a gessoed canvas on the front. They're really easy to pick up and just get started right away. In the future, you might decide that you would try something different. Like this is actually a gessoed board. This one, in fact, is like an acrylic enamel. It doesn't matter, but basically, it's a flatter board. You can buy those as well in different sizes, and they essentially are just a flatter, smoother surface. You might find this is something that you might like. And of course, there's the traditional sort of, canvas stretchers, the ones that are wrapped around wood. Those are a little nicer. The more you pay, the better you get. In the future, you might want to even consider making your own. There are videos and stuff out there about doing that. For the very first one, I would recommend getting a bigger size. Bigger is better. It gives you more room to work, especially when we're doing the very first project, which is only going to be in black and white. A larger canvas is going to be easy for you to fill up. Now, I think after the first assignment, you'll get an idea of how you work. And once you've done that, you can start deciding if you want to start going smaller or even bigger. Some people might find the size a little small. But for your very first project, I recommend a 12 by 16. They're, $6 plus your discount at Ellis. So it's probably going to cost you about $4, maybe $5. I hope I'm not wrong on that. So for all painters, that is what you want to use. Okay, I'm going to start talking about oil first. So anybody's dead set on acrylic use, go ahead and plug your ears. Just kidding. You should learn this too, because this might give you an idea of whether or not you want to pick this up in the future. Whether or not you use acrylic or oil, I take that back. You're going to want a palette. So this is my palette. It's basically a piece of tempered glass. I just picked up somewhere at a glass store. I use duct tape around the edges to help make sure it's not sharp, though they could even bevel the edges for you if you wanted. I don't know. Honestly, duct tape's fine. You'll keep it from cutting yourself. And I went ahead and taped some white paper on the back. And I just did that so when I am mixing thin colors on here and kind of spreading them out, that white will show through and it'll help me see what those colors are doing. Another good alternative would be to, tape a piece of sort of middle gray paper on the back. In fact, that might even be preferable. Black's a little too strong. Colored pieces aren't good. But white or middle gray are good options. There's other types of palettes too. I mean, you can get the paper throwaway type if you're not a fan of cleaning up and you want to just toss them. Those work good. There's other enclosed types. You'll just have to see what the store has to offer. Talk to the shop owner and talk about the pros and cons of each. But honestly, my recommendation, get yourself a nice big piece of glass. That works the best. You're going to want to get one of these sort of scrapers. They're the kind with a razor blade in the end. You can put them away when you're done, pull it out when you need it. And the reason for this is part of your cleanup. If if you don't just take a paper towel and wipe your palette every single time and wash it off, sometimes paint will dry in there and that's totally fine. This is a simple way of just being able to, oops, fell out, goodness. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Anyways, this is a simple way to be able to clean your palette. You can just scrape off. Since this is glass, this stuff comes off quite easily. It's a nice flat surface. And you can just throw this dried paint straight into the garbage can. Okay, so that's what that's for. Good way to clean your palette. Okay. Another note, I'll just talk about this right now, is if you are painting and you don't finish or you have some paint left over, there's a couple of things you can do. You can either take a small, palette knife. I'll show you what one of those looks like. So a small palette knife, scrape up the excess paint and put it in some sort of sealed container. Even better if you can take that sealed container and then put it in the fridge. The other option is just to get some basic, plastic food wrap, the kind of, saran wrap that you use to put your leftovers in the fridge. You can put that over the top of this and then be able to peel it back later, and your paint should stay for, 3 or 4 days. Otherwise, you're definitely going to want to put it in a sealed container or else it'll start to go bad. Okay, so back to oil paint specifically. Here's my messy mess of oil paints. Let's talk about what paint actually is. What is an oil paint? Essentially, what's in this tube is super concentrated pigment. Super concentrated pigment mixed with a binder. And the binder is oil. Probably some kind of linseed oil or walnut oil or something of that nature. We'll just say linseed oil. Yep, linseed oil specifically. Okay, and there's just enough in there of that in there to make this liquid. Okay. Now you can use this quite sparingly, and the way to save money and also to sort of affect your drying times is you add mediums to it. So this is the medium that I recommend you get if you're an oil painter. It's Galkyd. It basically is a combination of oil, thinner, and something called Damar crystals. Essentially, Damar crystals are dissolved in this mixture and they become like a glue. They're sort of a drying agent and they help make a protective film. So if you add this in the recommended amounts, you're gonna have to look up some of that information. But basically, you want to add maybe, no more than about 10% if you're just doing regular painting. That'll speed up your drying time of the oil paint, depending on how thick you put it down. And essentially, it'll make your oil paints, the steps between paintings dry in about 2 days. There's alternatives to this. They also offer a slow dry version, and this will, increase the drying time to maybe 4 to 6 days. Or Galkyd Light, which is, this one has a little bit more thinner in it. It's also on the slower drying time of around 4 days. And basically, sometimes you want that because you want to be able to go back to your painting and do touch-ups. You want to do stuff when the paint is still wet that you can't do once it's dried. I mean, of course, if something dries, you can paint over the top of it, but sometimes you don't want that. You want to be able to work back into it, pull paint off with a rag or something of that effect to I don't know, just make corrections when the paint is still wet. It's one of those options that oil painting affords that acrylic paint does not, and it's a good thing. Additionally, You know, you can buy just straight up linseed oil. This stuff really slows the drying time down. So you never want to use just linseed oil with your paint. If you put that into your paint, it basically is going to make the drying time like 4 months or something. It really slows everything down. However, you can play with the formula of this. So you want this to dry a little slower, you can add a little linseed oil to it. So this is kind of a nice ingredient to have on hand, just in case you want to play, you know, magician, alchemist, whatever you want to call it. The main thing is don't be afraid of these mediums. It's not as hard as it might sound. For the most part, you just take paint, you add a little of this to it, and it's gonna, you know, that's gonna be enough to sort of make this more liquidy, easier to use. You can spread it around on your canvas, and it'll dry in 2 days, and you'll be like, wow, that wasn't hard at all. Now, something that you might want to get is some kind of glaze cup. See, this one's quite dirty on the inside. It's been through a lot of use. Basically, what I do is when I'm about to paint, I pour a little bit of this medium in here. I get this, put it on my palette, and as I take my brush, or occasionally I dip it in here, dip it in the paint, kind of mix it around until I get the right medium that I want, or sort of the right mixture, and start spreading it around on the canvas. It's as simple as that. So one of these is nice. If you can get a couple more, that's fine. It doesn't have to be this big. I mean, it could be little tiny containers. They could be plastic. They can be glass jars. Just anything that you can pour this into. Typically, these are smaller. I just like to get the big ones because sometimes I paint on really big canvases. And thinner. Thinner is used for a couple of things. Now, it's basically a brush cleaner. That's probably, it's going to be your biggest, the biggest reason you're going to be using it. You want to put some inside of a glass jar that seals. This one's kind of neat because see these little like rings in there? There's a coil. It's dripping down my arm. It's a coil of metal, which creates texture. So when I open this up and I need to clean my brush, I can essentially take my brush, stick it in here, and just rub it over the top of this. And it helps clean out the bristles. I'm going to do another short video in a minute here over the sink, which talks about the cleaning procedure. But every occasionally you're going to want to use this even while you're painting. Though mostly you'll use this in the end when you're ready for cleanup for the day. Okay. And anything else? Brushes, of course. And this goes for both acrylic painters and oil painters. So I've asked you to get a couple of brushes. I mean, you can see over the years I've collected quite a few. If you take good care of them, they will last a long time. And that's something that you want to think about. I know some painters, they're very carefree about it. They'll get the cheapest brushes they can get. They don't clean them as much. They get really stiff and dirty and gross. And honestly, that's fine. Like if that's the way you work, if that's the way you're most creative, it doesn't bother me at all. I've seen people with brushes that basically look like plastic stumps because they're just so filled with paint. It's silly. And they just clump up the paint and dab it on, right? However, if you want to take advantage of the different bristle types and keep them nice, you're going to want to pay attention to how to clean them when we get to that part, okay? This is boar bristle. It's a little bit stiff. There's enough flexibility, you know, to kind of bounce on the canvas, but it's probably the most versatile. This is a flathead, and this is a filbert, I believe. Yes, it's got a little bit more of a rounded edge to each side. Additionally, you know, you're going to want to get some detail brushes, the little tiny ones with the sable hair. They're a little more inexpensive, obviously, because they have smaller smaller amounts of stuff on them, but they also are the ones that get destroyed the fastest because they have so little amount of hair on there. Eventually they're going to wear down from cleaning and use and whatever. So, just count on that. I'm sure they'll last through the semester, but if you're going to continue to paint, just know that, you'll have to pick these up every once in a while. Detail brushes. And that's about it. That's all I require you to get. There's other types like a fan brush that might be fun to use, but again, that's only if you're going to continue to paint and you want to think about that. Instead, just get the ones I ask you at first and sort of get more as you go. Okay, and one recommendation for your paint itself is always remember to close these lids as best you can when you're done for the day. Sometimes it's easy to forget, kind of put them on here sloppy, and what happens is as they sit in the box, the oil sort of evaporates out, kind of comes out of the lid, and it becomes really sticky and messy everywhere. I mean, you could essentially clean these up with a rag and some thinner and just kind of clean up the outside of these pretty easily. But just to keep your paints nice, don't forget to put the lid on tight. And one last thing about this jar of thinner, do remember to keep the lid on it when you're working. Now, I talked a little bit about ventilation, and with oil paint, that is probably the only downside I'd say, is that some people are sensitive to the solvents and that sort of thing. If you keep this stuff together properly, it really isn't that toxic. In fact, if anything, all it does is give a little bit of a fishy odor, and that is from the linseed oil that's in the paint itself. There's very little thinner in here that would really bother you, and as long as you keep the lid on this until you're actually using it, this is your cleaning jar full of straight thinner, there really isn't a lot that's going to be an issue. But that being said, it can be a problem in small enclosed spaces. So, keep windows open, maybe a door. You'll know if it's getting to you or not. You can tell if it's too much. Okay. You should always have something like this on hand, whatever kind of painter you are or not. Just some simple paper towels. They're good for wiping up quick messes, wiping off this. Sometimes I use them to sort of help squish out the excess linseed oil and paint from my bristles, or even dabbing away some paint off of your canvas. Though I wouldn't necessarily use this too much on your canvas itself, and the reason being is there are fibers in this which then can get stuck into the paint. So use this more for a secondary type of cleaning. The advantage of this is that they're easier to throw away, less to clean up. Still, there is a process. And also just some sort of, rags. You might want to take some old pillowcases and rip them up, or maybe some dirty old t-shirts that you don't care about. Those make nice working rags. These are good for taking paint right off the canvas itself and for cleaning up small messes. However, there is one thing I really want to stress. Oil-soaked rags and oil-soaked paper towels, for that matter, when bunched up and left in an area where there's not airflow and not adequate evaporation rate, can spontaneously combust. It's something that you really want to be aware of. So write that down, please. There is proper ways of disposing of these and letting them dry so that you can, clean them or reuse them or throw them away or whatever. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but please make a note of it. I'm going to say it twice. Don't let oil-soaked rags or anything with a lot of thinner and oil in it sit in these things wadded up in the corner of your room. Your house will burn down. Guaranteed. Maybe not today, but sometime. And lastly, there is a principle, and this applies more to oil painters, though acrylic painters should also take note, that when you paint, there is the golden rule, and that is thick over thin, okay? What is it? Fat over lean and wet over dry. So what that means is, let's see, a piece of paper nearby, that, here it is, any paint, so let's say this is the surface. Okay, this is the side view of your canvas. And I'm going to kind of over illustrate. Whatever the very first layers of paint that go down onto this canvas should first be thinner. What does that mean? Well, if we're going to say that oil is fat, that's a good way to remember it. Anything that has less oil in it, or more of this, is leaner. And it'll give you a much thinner, faster drying coat. Okay. Then as you add more paint, you can increase the amount of fat that's in it. Okay, you don't have to necessarily get some of this out of there, but you just need to make sure that you're not doing it in the reverse order. You get more paint that's got more fat particles in it, and those go on top. And why is that? Well, what you don't want to do is put wet paint or fat paint, paint that's going to dry slower on first. Okay, let's make this gooey mess here. That's my layer of fat paint. And then put a layer of thin drying paint over the top, because what basically happens is the thin layer will dry first and create a scab. And that barrier does not allow this to properly evaporate. This will not dry correctly. And so the only way for this stuff to dry is to basically try to push its way up through that thin layer and create cracks. Does that make sense? So you always want to put thinner layers on first, dry layers on first, and lean layers on first. Those need to go down, and then you can increasingly put wetter, slower drying, layers on top, thicker layers on top. Okay, now for acrylic users, it's very simple. In fact, it's so simple that I don't even have that much stuff here with me. You basically have paint. I don't have any acrylic, so let's pretend this is acrylic. You basically have paint that's suspended in the acrylic medium. You have a sort of additional medium that you can add to your pigment, which will thin it out. It's, again, cost effective. You're taking that concentrated pigment and you're spreading it out. You're spreading it out by adding a medium to it. And the medium additionally affects drying time. And that is super important for acrylic painters. I want to say the one thing about acrylic paint that really bothers me personally, or also can be very useful, I guess, it depends on the situation, is that it dries so quickly. In fact, it dries so quickly that you must at all times have a jar of water near you and not let your, not be negligent with your brushes and keep, putting them in that water, that thinner. If you get up to go to the bathroom, or if you go to have a cup of coffee, you got to throw that brush in the water, or else the paint will dry into your bristles, making this into a little plastic nub. Acrylic is very durable, but it and for that reason will ruin your carpets, clothes, and brushes. So make sure you have a thing of water nearby so that you can keep adding to it. That being said, it's really easy to work with because all you need is like two things. You need water, that's your thinner, and some kind of medium. And you can add a little of both, not too much, but just the right amount to give it more of a liquidy, fluid feeling, make it more workable to your tastes, and that's all you need, essentially. Cold wax medium. Whoops, hold on a second. I forgot about that. nuts. Okay, well, I left that at the school, unfortunately, so I don't have it. But you can write this down. Unfortunately, I don't have a visual aid. When you're working with oil, another medium that you can use is cold wax medium. In fact, we have an assignment that requires it, so you are going to have some. But even when you're not using it for that one specific assignment, you can add like a tiny bit, like a teaspoon, into an amount of this, the Galkid. And what it does is it dissolves in, and then it makes your painting medium look more matte. And some people like that. They prefer the matte look over the glossy look. They like how it reflects more evenly than the glossy look, where sometimes it reflects sort of a little bit too haphazardly. So keep that in mind. That's a good thing to have. For the acrylic painters, you're going to be using what's called a gel medium, and it basically acts the same way. It's a way of adding a medium to this paint, stretches it out, stretches the pigment out, but it also gives it body. It sort of floofs it up. Yes, I said floof. Okay, and the same thing for oil painters. Cold wax medium is going to floof your paint. It's going to give it more texture. You're going to be able to spread it around with a brush, and it's going to have more of a tactile feeling to it than when you work with just sort of thin layers of paint. Okay, I think that's it on mediums, and then I'm going to take you over to the sink in a minute here, probably in a separate video, so that I can, show you some of the cleanup techniques that you'll need to do at the end of each session.